So just for the record, I recorded, am recording these voiceovers while I'm still dealing with COVID. Maybe not the best idea, but I've been laying on my futon for like 5 days and I'm bored as shit. So anyway, in my last installment in this series, I covered the history of the Holm Hotel, a story with lots of early history and not so much later on. The story of this next place, just a few blocks north of the Holm, is somewhat similar. However, while I believe the Holm was constructed and primarily maintained as a run-of-the-mill, low-cost lodging space, the story of the Grand Central Hotel, originally the New Grand Central, is a little different. Its original intent was to be a higher-class hotel and a top option to be chosen as it stood only a couple of blocks from the city of Portland's main train station. But, somewhat like the Holm, its reputation and history faded into obscurity over time. And it all started, like with the Holm, in the early 1890s. It started in a place that made perfect sense considering its original purpose. The southeast corner of 3rd and Flanders, in the heart of Chinatown. But back in 1892, the area was better known as the city's North End, where crime in all of its facets ran rampant. But visitors from out of town didn't necessarily know this. The 5-story tall, primarily brick and concrete structure, built in the Romanesque Revival style, towered above many surrounding buildings, including a row of hotels along 3rd Avenue. The Grand Central got its name from the train station, located only a couple of blocks away. While this spot is better known as Union Station today, its official name when it opened was the Grand Central Passenger Station. When newcomers arrived, one of the buildings that stood out the most nearby was the Grand Central Hotel. But beyond those who came by train, the hotel was only blocks from the Willamette River, where some arrived by boat. It was also close to a nearby streetcar line. People could come there in just about any way possible. Constructed in 1892 at a cost of $105,000, plus an extra $20,000 for the interior furnishings, adding up to $125,000, or more than $4 million in today's money. The project was primarily driven by Henry Weinhard. Yes, that Henry Weinhard. The hotel contained 142 rooms, handsomely furnished, an attractive dining room, barber shop, electric lights, and an elevator. It was a cut above most lodgings in the area and was economical at the same time, described as one of the first-class houses west of Chicago that only charged a rate of $1 to $2 per night for a stay. While the Grand Central is no longer around and much of its later years have been fairly lost to history, this place has some really interesting stories, both funny and tragic. It's absolutely a history worth diving into. We see in this 1889 Sanborn fire map that the hotel's location was an open vacant lot. But in the maps for 1901, we are introduced to this very young hotel. We see it outlined as it, for the most part, was originally set up. Not to keep referencing back to my Portland brothels video, but we can see at this time, nearly half the block that the Grand Central was located on was lined with female boarding, aka brothels. We see the hotel's office to the northwest corner of the building, at its entrance, and a bar and the barber shop just south of there. Open spaces in the wall suggest the bar was directly accessible from the hotel lobby, as made sense for the neighborhood. The large dining room was to the back, or eastern, portion of the building, while it appears there was also a small bathhouse within the building. While the hotel's close proximity to the river made it a potential attraction for people arriving by boat, it left it open to the possible catastrophes of, say, a flood. Less than 2 years after the hotel's opening, Portland experienced its worst flood ever, trumping even the flood of 1996, with river waters traversing several blocks of the city. With it being years before the city would build a seawall in the late 20s, flooding was an annual thing in Portland, but not to the extent as it was in 1894, with several feet of water building up in the downtown area. The whole entire North End ended up underwater. But the North Enders took the natural disaster in stride the best way they knew how, by having boat races down the flooded streets. Boat races I'm willing to bet were being gambled on by locals. One man even claimed to catch a massive steelhead trout within the walls of Union Station. But for the Grand Central, like most places in the area, it sustained several feet of water on its ground floor. Newspapers noted this portion was completely wrecked. While most buildings did not sustain any more than $1,000 in damages, the Grand Central sustained approximately $2,500 in damages. Despite the place's grandeur, because the place was a hotel and, more importantly, a hotel in the North End, the Grand Central was not an outlier when it came to two things extremely common in hotels from the late 1800s into the 1920s: thefts and tragic deaths. Thefts were common in Portland hotels, and the whole city for that matter, for many reasons. Many people back then probably left their rooms unlocked. People would often be away from their rooms for hours at a time. And also, Portland was a drinking man's town. Lots of men would leave their hotels and go get plastered, come back, and sometimes not notice for hours that something had gone missing. Sometimes it was just a matter of 2 or more people sharing a room and one of those individuals being a thief. It was also an easy crime to get away with, especially if you went unseen. Old Portland papers were filled with blips about people reporting their hotel rooms being robbed with no clue who could have been responsible. In July 1903, a Frank Kemper came to town and was staying at the Grand Central. He'd been seen walking around with an Annie Pollard, a notorious North End thief associated with the more so notorious local dive saloon of a John Fritz. I'm not sure if this John Fritz was related to the saloon owner Fred Fritz, of whom my last episode in the series focused on, but I get the feeling they probably were. Fritz had taken over the place, albeit in name only, for an even more notorious North End character named Bob Patterson, who was still pulling the strings there. Conveniently enough, on the night Annie was seen palling around with Frank Kemper, she showed up at the Grand Central looking for a room. After getting one, she left the hotel shortly after, and when Kemper came back, he noticed he'd been robbed and his room key was gone. The men who ran the hotel at this time, J.P. Sharkey, who was also a city council person at the time, and C.E. Fields, filed a complaint against a detective, Frank Snow, after Kemper left town, claiming they quickly ushered him out of town so as to protect Pickpocket Annie and Fritz/Patterson's saloon. Back then, the police were known to be paid off by local brothels and saloon owners to keep the pressure off, and it was thought such was the case with Frank Kemper's robbery. This case made headlines, perhaps primarily due to a string of crimes happening in the city that the mayor at the time, George Henry Williams, chose to act like weren't happening. However, in this case, Detective Snow was absolved of any wrongdoing, and even when Frank Kemper was contacted later, he stated plainly that he was not rushed out of town. Other robberies passively reported on included the theft of $200 in coins from an A.B. Shotter visiting from Wisconsin. It was suggested a local woman knew he was carrying lots of money. In May 1920, an F.M. Thompson came back to his room to find his Commentary on the Bible According to St. John had gone missing. Kind of an odd thing to steal, but I don't know, maybe it was worth something. But some of these stories were kind of funny. In 1919, Oscar Johnson was staying at the Grand Central when he rushed to police headquarters, claiming money had been stolen right out of his shirt pocket where he placed it. Likely suspicious how one could pull this off so easily, the first thing police asked was if they could check his shirt pocket, and sure enough, the cash was right there. Considering the time and place, I get the feeling Mr. Johnson was probably drunk at the time. In 1904, an H.F. Smith had a $125 diamond ring stolen from his room. An unknown woman had been seen in the hotel, and she was believed to have been the thief. In the description given to police on the woman, it was noted that she had 2 moles side by side on her neck. Not long after the robbery, 2 officers near 6th and Stark saw a woman who just happened to have 2 small moles close together on her neck. They stopped the woman, a Della Estes, and she had the ring in her possession. In classic criminal fashion, she claimed that Smith had gifted the ring to her. But I found a story from 1910 wherein the excuse for a theft was even more ridiculous. On June 23rd, police were called to the Grand Central by a Milton Blake who claimed a John Carey had stolen a watch from his pocket as he slept in a chair in the bar/lobby area. When the police arrived, Carey was casually drinking at the bar, and the watch was found on his person. His excuse was that he had seen Blake fall asleep and took his watch to protect it from other, quote, dishonest men who might have come along and robbed him in his sleep. When Blake came to and heard this story, he actually chose to believe Carey, but fortunately the police didn't and still arrested Carey. But then, Blake failed to appear in court or even to reclaim the watch, which had been taken into evidence. Again, with Mr. Blake, I think we have a guy who was just drunk. Drunk men falling asleep in lobbies and businesses was a common thing in the City of Roses. And even employees at the hotel weren't safe from theft. In a small piece from 1907, the night clerk at the hotel, G. Rayleigh, was shocked to discover his bicycle had been taken from a lobby rack in the same room he was working in. And in 1915, another clerk from the hotel, Charles Wansley, suddenly left town for the coastal place of Tillamook. After his departure, the manager of the hotel noticed an expensive camera of his had gone missing. Authorities tracked down Wansley at the coast, and lo and behold, the camera was found in his room. There was a lot of tomfoolery going on in terms of cons and robberies, but sometimes I almost feel the victims had it coming, if nothing more than to learn a lesson for being so naive. Let me then bring to you the story of Edward Keyes, a resident at the Grand Central in 1910. Keyes was running a con, In short, he was peddling a concoction that he called the mineral water cure, which, if taken, could cure alcoholism. When a farmer named Gustav Cheney visited Portland from South Dakota, he had a chance encounter with Keyes, who told him of this cure, and that he'd been offered massive sums of money for the exclusive rights to it. However, he offered some to Cheney for a reasonable sum to take back to South Dakota and sell off there. This reasonable sum was $800 up front, as well as a mortgage on Cheney's farm to the sum of $1,700. Despite red flags all around, Cheney willingly paid this amount and took some of this magic water back east. He would return to the city later, going to the police after he found that the concoction he was given only made people want to drink more. Keyes would be arrested for this scam at his room at the Grand Central, wherein, as you'd assume, he denied the whole thing. I know it was another time, and I know we've got stupid people falling for stupid things all the time nowadays, but Jesus, dude, how did you fall for this? Maybe he was drunk. I've got to stop blaming that for everything. But for all of this levity, there is the darker side, representative of many of Portland's earlier, lower-end hotels, or even just hotels in rougher parts of town, that being tragic deaths, many of which were self-inflicted. It's a tragic and often unrecognized part of Portland's seedier past, where numerous people, mostly men, would check out hotel rooms all over town just to end it all. Under such circumstances, it should be of no surprise that sometimes these men would go unidentified. One of the earliest newspaper articles on the Grand Central that I was able to find involved death. This October 25th, 1894 piece documented the death of a Henry Newman found shot to death in his room there. It was presumed the shot was self-inflicted, leading me to assume the weapon used was still in the room. But perhaps a little wiggle room for mystery there. Another similar story appeared in a February 23, 1904 newspaper in reference to a Frank Salter who ingested laudanum, a type of opium, while he stayed at the hotel. He miraculously survived after being rushed to the hospital, and while he was in recovery, and that recovery was swift, he refused to tell anyone in the aftermath why he had chosen to take such an action. Another surprisingly frequent form of tragedy involved the hotel's elevator. On December 30th, 1912, a porter at the hotel named Daniel Hollenbach was working on the third floor when it seems he accidentally fell down the elevator shaft, 3 stories, sustaining a broken neck. A few years later, on October 1st, 1919, a Jacob Martala apparently confused the doors to the elevator for a, different kind of door and just stepped right through, falling several feet to the basement floor below. He filed suit against the hotel for recklessness, which I guess is fair, but confusing the doors? I don't know. Maybe he was drunk. I've got to stop using that. Wait, there it is. He was drunk. Called it. Yeah. Anyway, needless to say, his lawsuit was thrown out. But, dialing it back a bit, the most disturbing story I found in relation to that hotel's elevator happened on August 3rd, 1909. Shortly after midnight, 17-year-old Andrew Schilling rushed to catch the elevator as it was going up. Despite the elevator room already in the process of going up to the next floor, Schilling took a chance and leaped up to climb aboard when his head ended up crushed between the floor of the room and the frame around the door. The operator, John Papard, quickly stopped and reversed the elevator's power to literally avoid a decapitation occurring. Despite Papard's efforts, Schilling's skull was crushed and he died later at the hospital. This death just happened to occur in the midst of an investigation on local hotels that were hiring underage elevator operators. The law stipulated that operators had to be 18 years or older, and John Papard was only 14. But he was just one of several underage operators found working in hotels all over town. Through this investigation, it came out that at least one other teenager had operated the elevator at the Grand Central in the past. Ultimately, the proprietor of the hotel at the time, J.A. Tilley, was held responsible, not just for having underage elevator operators, but also for allowing elevator doors to be left open frequently. Likely, I would think, leading to the accident Daniel Hollenbach had back in 1912. Tilley would ultimately be fined $25, along with court costs. And that brings us to 1908, and a specimen named Charles Cole. This guy's story is so ridiculous that I need to just stop right now and tell you this story in person, okay? I'll be right back. Oh! Hi, everybody. I am, still very much in the throes of COVID, but I'm not going to use that as an excuse to not tell my truth. Or better yet, someone else's fantasy. So, Charles Cole fancies himself an inventor, but he's not your run-of-the-mill lazy, and that's not very nice. But, you know, while a lot of inventors are out there thinking like, I'm gonna create a device that cracks your egg and cooks it at the same time, that kind of stuff. Charles Cole has loftier aspirations, and he's had lofty aspirations for almost 20 years. And he has one hell of an idea, and he's putting the pieces in place while he's staying in a room on the 4th floor at the Grand Central Hotel in Portland, of all places. While in there, he was trying to put together and perfect a model for a planned approximately 150-foot wide airship that he was going to have constructed, and he was going to have it run on heated air. He wasn't even going to use gas to power it. And this massive ship was supposed to be able to take him, several others who I guess would help him in his endeavors or something, along with all the supplies they need. And he was going to, this was his plan, he was going to fly this thing to the North Pole, and he was going to settle there. And he had this belief that I don't think he had personally substantiated, I think he just assumed it to be a reality, that there was this constant just beam of electricity going between the pole and the sun, and it was always there, and that he would be able to harness this electricity very easily, apparently, and he was going to use that electricity to provide heat that he needed, to cook food, to run any equipment he needed. He was just going to harness this electricity. And the reason he was doing all of this was because again, it's 1908, he wanted to use that electricity from the sun to melt the ice in the Arctic. He essentially wanted to intentionally melt the polar ice caps. He wanted to melt all of this ice, and he thought in doing this he was going to like reconfigure the structure of like Greenland and like northern Canada. He really thought he was going to be able to do this. And he'd already been spending so many years just trying to put together a model for the ship that he was going to use to get there. I don't even know how much time this guy had actually spent trying to figure out how he was going to use the sun to melt this Arctic ice. And his motive for doing this, he didn't just want to do this just to fuck with the planet. He figured the Arctic is in a perpetual state of being frozen. So all the water out there is just getting frozen and frozen. So over time, there's just more and more and more ice being created. And at some point, the ice would become so great, just the sheer volume of it, that it would just shatter the Earth's equilibrium. And it would just cause this massive melt by itself. But it would be so abrupt and so catastrophic, as opposed to Cole's idea of just kind of slowly melting it and not allowing it to grow anymore. This equilibrium eruption, or whatever you want to call it, was going to be so great that it was going to just flood the Earth again. And he literally said that Noah's Ark 2, the second version of Noah's Ark, was coming if he was not able to get this ship made and to fly it out to the Arctic so he could start melting all this ice down. And he's conceiving this and he's thinking of all this while he's in these very early stages, and he's just living out of this simple hotel room in this simple hotel on the north end of Portland. And from what I've gathered, I don't think he ever quite made it. I'm pretty sure. I really hope he didn't try, because something tells me he probably would have died on the way there anyway. Okay, seriously, after that story, it's really all downhill from here. By the time the 1910s came along, the North End was in full swing, and with Skid Row also just a few short blocks away, the charm of the once gorgeous Grand Central Hotel had begun to fade. The city's more flashy hotels of the time, like Multnomah and the Benson, were more in the center of downtown, while these northern ones began to waste away. Most of the Grand Central's clientele were travelers who didn't know or didn't care about the reputation of the area it was in, or were people who just couldn't afford anything any better. And with the main hub of commerce in the city moving further and further inward from the river, 3rd Avenue began to fade as well. With the push from struggling businesses along this stretch, an idea became a reality in 1914 with the construction of the Great Light Way. Originally stretching from Yamhill to Burnside Streets, large arches of arcade lights were constructed, crossing over each intersection along 3rd Avenue. It was absolutely gorgeous at night, and something I really wish was still around today. In 1915, the way stretched up past the Grand Central at 3rd and Flanders, ending 1 block further up at Gleason. Therefore, in some pictures of the hotel, you can see the arches of the Great White Way out in front. Unfortunately, due to the drivers of the old days, these arches were constantly being damaged by careless drivers. The Great Light Way was deemed a success, bringing attention and charm back to a struggling avenue, but it only lasted so long. By 1937, with the Depression on, the power was finally cut to the lights, and over the next couple of years, the arches were demolished. But it was at the origin of it all that the hotel changed hands, and in 1915 was leased by a Japanese businessman named T. Yuasha, who probably would have just bought the place outright if the laws of the time didn't forbid it. As a native of Japan, and not America, Yuasha was not allowed to own real estate. He was one of many Japanese and Chinese immigrants that took control of hotels in the area, which, again, was where the city's Chinatown and Japantowns had been located anyway. He was also likely trying to take advantage of the recently constructed Great Light Way, knowing it was going to pass right by his place. Yuasha would also rename this hotel as the American Hotel, or Hotel American. They all went back and forth like that back then. And this is where information on the place becomes more and more sparse. In the years after the place was renamed, most of the information published in newspapers referenced recent refurbishings in the building. After another fix-up in 1921, the place was promoted for having lots of hot water and, quote, good bathtubs. The hotel also occasionally hosted auctions, and, as makes sense for the location, sometimes had gambling busts, probably among other things. Otherwise, it bounced between multiple owners up until 1950, before it was purchased by the Union Gospel Mission. When this happened, the place was converted into what was known as the Friendly Home. With a history of working with the homeless, I can only assume at least partially that the building's rooms were used for housing the homeless. The Union Gospel Mission has had a long presence in the Chinatown area, partially explaining why the area has had such a long-standing homeless population. By the time of the home's closure in 1973, the building was left vacant, described at the time as just another flophouse in the area. While I have no evidence to show, I wonder if the building was, at some point or to some extent, utilized in a manner similar to other places I've discussed, like the Holm and the Pomona hotels that were converted into chicken coop hotels with rooms the size of cubicles to house a lot of transients in the area. Considering its size compared to others, if the Grand Central was used in a similar way, I doubt they had to make the rooms any smaller. The Royal Palm Hotel, which still stands across 3rd from where the Grand Central once stood, became another place where those who were destitute could go and stay at a reasonable price. Whatever the case, by the early 70s, the Grand Central was in about as poor a shape as most others in the area. I doubt it was up to code, and it probably needed a great deal of work done on it. Train travel was hardly what it had been some 80 years earlier, and regardless, this hotel hadn't been what it was originally built for a very long time. The writing was on the wall. Even by the time this picture was taken in 1968, we can see the old charmer just sort of off by itself, like it's waiting to be taken away. And finally, in 1978, it was. Coming in at the end of an era that stretched back to the 1930s of old buildings coming down in Portland, the Grand Central Hotel was finally reduced to dust. And only a couple years after its demise, the city began discussing plans for constructing a Chinese garden. While it would take many years to come to fruition, in 1999 construction began on these gardens, which opened in 2000. And its location? The same block where the Grand Central Hotel once stood. There's even an indentation on the wall outside of the gardens at 3rd and Flanders that syncs up well with where the main entrance to the hotel once was. But before going, I've saved potentially the most notorious story in relation to this hotel for last. It served as the second installment in an over 100 episode series I used to do called Historic Murders of Portland. The following is a recut of that video, trying my best to, admittedly, cut out some sniffling I was doing as I videoed it on a cold early March day. And on that note, I'll now take you back to 2019. Union Station. One of Portland's most gorgeous landmarks, to say the least. Been serving as Portland's main transportation go-by-train hub since the 1890s, if I'm correct. But something that you probably won't hear about too much in the history books is that a trunk was found back in 1910 inside Union Station. Now you may be thinking, big deal, you got people traveling by train, they have to transport their stuff somehow, they have luggage, why would there not be trunks in there? Well, this was a particularly interesting trunk. Now, the newspapers are a little bit janky in terms of exactly what day this trunk was discovered, whether it was June 20th or June 21st, 1910. Based on the information I've seen, I'm led to believe that it was probably June 20th, probably later evening, June 20th, when the trunk was found. So this trunk is discovered, again, I believe probably the evening of June 20th, 1910. And it apparently had documentation on it that said it was to be shipped out to go on a train going to a certain town up in Washington. However, the area that the trunk was discovered, it wasn't the right spot. It wasn't near where a train would be going to that town. So it almost, had that detail been ignored, this trunk would have been lugged onto a train and sent north into Washington. But instead, they dragged it back, put it into luggage storage or whatever. And it's a good thing they did, because after doing that, one of the men who worked in Union Station started noticing blood seeping out of the trunk. The trunk was then cracked open, understandably, and they discovered that a man had been stuffed into it. And what's most troubling of all about that is later on, authorities reached the conclusion that they felt that this man was still alive when he was stuffed in this trunk. So when this body was discovered, it was found that the individual had literally been stuffed and crammed into this trunk. He had a piece of shirt that had been tightly wrapped around his neck, showing that he had been strangled. But in the aftermath, it was also determined that this individual had died as a result of suffocation, but he also had been beaten. He'd been brutally beaten all over his body. And it was, I mean, this is 1910. Stuff like this didn't happen that often in Portland. And, you know, the story breaks from iconic Union Station, which, I mean, granted, it was only like, it was a fairly new station at the time, so it wasn't as iconic, but your city's main train station, and they find a human body stuffed in a trunk set to be shipped out to Washington. And the most troubling aspect was it took a couple of days to identify this guy. So, you know, they have a body, but they don't know who he is, why he's here, what his motivations were being here, who he came with, who would have motive to kill him, where are the killers at now? You'd assume they would be long gone by this point, but it was identified after about a day or two. They were able to establish the identity of this guy that they found as a William Johnson from Kent, Washington. So he actually was from up in Washington, and he had traveled down here. So with William Johnson's name, they're able to kind of put a few pieces together. It's known on the outset that he came up from Washington, and he had reportedly come to Portland with a man who went by the name of A.C. Powers. Granted, this was an alias. And then there was a woman who claimed to be William Johnson's wife. She identified herself as Mrs. Johnson. And they had come to the city together. And they were seen checking into the Grand Central Hotel, which is where I'm heading to now, because that plays significance in the actual crime, where it took place. And here's the Royal Holm Hotel, which I think is probably apartments by now, but one lingering old school piece of old Portland history, because the site where the Grand Central Hotel was is, well, putting it in past tense, obviously it's gone now. But according to descriptions and outlines, right here, these Chinese gardens are at this corner, be the southeast corner of Flanders and 3rd. This is where the Grand Central Hotel was located. The Grand Central Hotel, you have to use your imagination a bit. There's a big hotel right here. And that's where William Johnson and this woman identifying as his wife and this AC Powers guy got themselves rooms at the hotel. And what's interesting is William Johnson stayed in room 119. His wife stayed with Powers in room 109 right across the way. So once they identified William Powers, they were able to track what he was doing. And thus they were able to find out that last time he was really seen, he was at his hotel. I guess it makes sense to circle the block. It's interesting because the Chinese gardens here, I mean, we're in Chinatown. They pretty much encapsulate this whole block, which is Flanders to Everett and then second to 3rd. And according to what I saw, the Grand Central Hotel pretty much took up this whole block. So we're just kind of circling around where this massive hotel was. But they find William Johnson's hotel room, and it is a gruesome crime scene, splattered with blood. I believe they found rags with blood on them, maybe possibly the killers trying to clean up the crime scene. And it had been determined, in addition to his suffocation and strangulation, it was determined that William Johnson had been beaten mercilessly with a doorknob. This doorknob would ultimately be deemed to have been removed from the room right across the hall, room 109, where his wife and AC Powers were supposedly located. And wouldn't you know it, later in the day, June 21st, you know, day after this brutal crime happened, Mr. Powers and Mrs. Johnson are tracked down pretty easily. Why? Because they're still in town. In fact, one of the sources I read said they were still in the Grand Central Hotel. They hadn't even left their hotel room yet, so obviously they're either were incredibly dumb or they just assumed their plan would work so perfectly that they put a they put a sticker saying send it to this town in Washington, and then put the trunk in an area that wasn't going that direction, so the trunk didn't even go out. So it was real easy to catch these people because they were still in their hotel room right here. Unreal. This isn't going to be the only case I bring to you where the criminals involved are incredibly dumb. And it was determined pretty quickly that AC Powers was really a guy named Jesse Webb, who was a real estate guy based out of Seattle. They also figured out the woman posing as William Johnson's wife was a woman named Carrie Kirsch. So things already aren't boding well that you have a woman pretending to be a man going to town with him with another guy, and then the guy who's supposed to be your husband turns out murdered. I mean, if you really are this guy's wife, why are you nowhere to be found? It turned out that Kirsch and Webb were actually lovers, so you can see how they might have gone in together in taking a man's life. And William Johnson was not filthy rich, but he was a fairly well-to-do guy. He had a good share of money, and when Webb and Kirsch were tracked down, still in Portland, Kirsch had almost $2,000 on her. Where'd that come from? Probably from William Johnson, who was carrying cash with him, a lot of cash. Jesse Webb happened to have a couple of bloody handkerchiefs on him because he apparently was too stupid to get rid of them. This is a day later, you know, good job getting rid of the evidence. And beyond that, he's carrying a watch that belongs to William Johnson. So, what more reason do you need to believe that these two people suckered good old William Johnson from Kent, Washington, down to Portland, probably showed up at Union Station, walked a couple blocks this way, got a room at the Grand Central, and once they were settled, you know, I don't know exactly what they were doing. Maybe they were trying to get him to go in on a business deal. Whatever the case, they tricked him. They pulled an old trick and got him to a whole other town. And I don't know, maybe the idea was, hey, we're all based out of Washington. We'll bring him down here, kill him, and then ultimately go back home, and no one's going to suspect us because we're from Seattle. How are they going to tie us to a murder that happened in Chinatown, Portland, Oregon? But alas, it didn't go that way, because these people were incredibly ignorant criminals, so it seems. So, you know, there really wasn't much to be said after that. It was pretty much a done deal that these were the killers of Mr. William Johnson. And so, the way that law enforcement more or less figured it was Carrie Kirsch, you know, manipulated William Johnson into thinking she had feelings for him. She had feelings for him. And it was all part of the grift. I don't even know if I'm using that term right. Jesse Webb is just this other guy coming along for the ride. He probably is trying to act like he's a buddy, befriending William Johnson, and it's all just a fun little casual affair until, again, as police theorize, William Johnson became aware that Carrie Kirsch really wasn't into him at all. In fact, she was into the other guy that was with him, and it was at that point that things started to unravel, and they realized, well, if we're gonna pull this whole plan off, we're gonna kill this guy and get his money, we gotta do it now. And so there's theorization that they drugged him, possibly disoriented him, but it's believed wholeheartedly that, again, the doorknob from Webb and Kirsch's room across the hall from William Johnson was used to beat William Johnson about, and then he was ultimately strangled. And where the hell was that guy going? Maybe he just ditched a body in a trunk. I don't know. But then, of course, they both get busted and have to go on trial for a murder that, I mean, they have evidence from the trial found on their person. This is not going to end well for these two. So Jesse Webb goes up on trial first in the later months of 1910. Claims that he was intoxicated and therefore not really totally responsible for his actions, which, whatever. And claimed that this wasn't cold-blooded murder. This was the act of two men both madly in love, quarreling for the affections of another. And maybe that's how it escalated. But the fact of the matter is, if that was the case and Jesse Webb just, I guess, won the fight, the fact of the matter is, you know, if this is just an act of passion, once you knock William Johnson out, you get out of there. But no, this was possibly a drugging, this was a beating, this was a strangling, this was multiple things. This was cold-blooded murder. And if it's really just about love, why'd you take William Johnson's money with you when you left? So I didn't really believe his story for a second, and he actually got convicted. And then, as with so many other criminals, Governor Oswald West overturned the decision to hang, which, I mean, I guess I can respect Oswald West. Way back in the day, he was a governor who obviously didn't like the death penalty and commuted sentences whenever he could. Carrie Kirsch's trial, which came along after, was not quite so clear-cut. You know, she was able to make the argument that she wasn't there when it happened, because it was deemed that Jesse Webb was the sole killer, at least by the prosecution. So, Carrie Webb made the argument she wasn't even there. She didn't know what happened. She didn't know that there was a murder that happened till afterwards. She was completely innocent. She also maintained the ruse that she had planned on probably ultimately marrying William Johnson, and explained away the fact that she had almost $2,000 of his money as, we were planning on getting married soon. So, sorry, I just heard someone yell my name. So he gave me this money because he loved me. Which I don't buy, because she obviously was in love with Jesse Webb. But it was very hard, because they didn't really have what they had on Webb. It was very hard to find a conviction. It took a jury forever to kind of figure out what to do in this situation. And so it seems by 1911, Jesse Webb, I guess, finds God or something. And he's sitting there rotting away in jail, and he is, according to himself, which he wasn't using this as a way to get off, his sentence, so I kind of have a tendency to believe that this was real. He was just grief-stricken, and he felt so incredibly guilty for the murder, and he told people, he said, I just want to die already, just get rid of me. He even said himself that Carrie had no part in it, which may have just been him trying to save another life. And ultimately, they compromised with Carrie Kirsch since they couldn't figure out really what to do. They found her guilty of manslaughter. It's not murder, but you're getting busted for something. And it's really sad. One of the last things I read on this thing was last newspaper article, January 1911. Jesse Webb, again, he had a family. And his daughter, who was obviously fairly young, he was not that old himself, she died after complications following a stroke after her health had gone into decline, with all this stuff that was happening with her father and him going to prison for murder and all of this stuff. So that was one of the last pieces I saw written on this case. So Jesse Webb's, sadness and lethargic behavior was well-founded, and it did affect his family, unfortunately. So, it wasn't just the people who were directly involved in this crime that were affected. It was family members outside of it. So, very sad when all is said and done. And as usual, it was just another murder for money, And that's the story of the William Johnson trunk murder. As I shuffle on through Chinatown, hoping not to get stabbed.
And while the Grand Central Hotel has been gone for a very long time, for a time there was one last little reminder of this once standing home away from home that lingered along First Avenue, not too far away from where the hotel originally stood. The stone sign marked Grand Central that once graced the side of the building was left along a parking lot next to the Import Plaza building. According to the Cafe Unknown blog, successful local businessman Bill Nato obtained this piece and put it out in front of the plaza, which he owned at the time. It has since been relocated, which, let's be honest, is probably for the best. But it's still kept close by. This last lingering memory of a hotel with a sometimes patchy but fascinating history.